You through the eyes of the covert narcissist, diving into their psychological horror. Let's step together into a shadowed theater of the mind, a place where selfhood is not solid but staged. Imagine slipping into the consciousness of a narcissist. According to clinical psychologist Dr. Ramoni Dervisula, narcissism is an addiction to a false self, a performance of grandeur built to hide a hollow core. We're not entering a mind that merely lies. We're entering a mind that lives its own lie. Every gesture, every smile, every carefully calibrated word becomes part of an ongoing performance designed to secure narcissistic supply, the admiration, fear, or submission of others. Psychologists say this supply acts like a drug. The narcissist's sense of self crumbles without it, compelling them to manipulate and control perceptions to feed a fragile identity. Now picture the next layer of darkness. Empathy, the capacity to feel another's pain, is simply absent. Psychologists like Dr. Craig Malkin note that this isn't a mere choice but a developmental deficit. The narcissist's empathy never matured beyond an infant's need, leaving them indifferent to the wreckage they cause. Spouses, friends, children, no one is safe from becoming raw material for their supply. The narcissist's moral boundaries, if they ever existed, erode completely under the pressure of this addiction. Victims often experience what trauma therapists call betrayal trauma, the psychic injury of realizing that someone you love never truly considered your feelings at all. But there's an even more chilling variant of this mental theater: the covert, or fragile, narcissist. Unlike the grandiose narcissist, who flaunts their achievements openly, the covert narcissist moves through the world as a wounded aristocrat, entitled but aggrieved, haughty yet insecure. Psychologists describe them as vulnerably grandiose. They hold the same fantasies of specialness but feel chronically under-recognized. They have learned, often through early humiliation or repeated rejection, that overt displays of superiority can backfire. So they cultivate a subtler persona, one that cloaks manipulation in self-pity, sarcasm, or quiet contempt. For victims, this is especially confusing. Dr. Carol McBride, a specialist in narcissistic abuse, explains that covert narcissists weaponize their wounds, drawing empathy from others even as they quietly exploit them. Inside this covert narcissist's mind, envy burns hotter than ambition. They look at more overt narcissists, those with real beauty, money, or status, and seethe. Envy, wrote psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, is the most destructive of emotions because it devours the self from within. For the covert narcissist, this envy becomes a worldview. Life is a cosmic injustice, a stolen cake. Others always get what was meant for them. Psychologists see this as a regression to a childlike state where the world's resources feel finite and personal. If someone else has admiration, it must have been taken away from me. And then there's the final act in this grim play, the fantasy of power. Covert narcissists, like their grandiose counterparts, harbor dreams of domination and admiration, but their supply is meager, intermittent, and hard-won. Because of this scarcity, they target people with weak boundaries, those who, often through their own traumas, are more easily manipulated. Psychologists call this trauma bonding, a cycle where victims, starved for love, become trapped in the very relationship that harms them. The narcissist, sensing this vulnerability, works tirelessly to extract juice from them. Attention, praise, emotional labor, until the victim is depleted. For victims, recovery is both urgent and possible. Psychologists emphasize the importance of rebuilding boundaries, recognizing manipulation patterns, seeking therapy, and reclaiming one's sense of reality. Dr. Judith Herman, an authority on trauma, argues that healing begins with safety, creating emotional and physical distance from the narcissist, and proceeds to reconnect Ion with a supportive community. Victims can also benefit from psychoeducation. Learning the mechanics of narcissistic behavior reduces self-blame and restores agency. So, as we remove the VR goggles from this unsettling experiment, we're left not just with a grotesque portrait of the narcissist, but also with clarity. Understanding the psychological machinery of narcissism, the addiction to supply, the absence of empathy, the corrosive envy, arms victims with insight. In this knowledge lies the first step toward freedom, no longer being an unwitting character in the narcissist's play, but the author of your own. Imagine, If you will, the act of sucking the juice, extracting the narcissistic supply from another human being. It's not casual. It's deliberate, intricate, almost performative. Psychologists like Dr. Ramoni Dervisula describe this as a behavioral addiction. The narcissist's sense of self literally depends on manipulating others' perceptions and emotions. Every carefully crafted phrase, every inflection, every gesture becomes a tool for extracting admiration, fear, or compliance. For the victim, this is subtly corrosive. Over time, they may experience anxiety, confusion, or the insidious erosion of self-confidence. Trauma specialists call this psychic vampirism, a slow siphoning of emotional energy that leaves the target drained yet unaware of the mechanism behind it. But here is where the story takes a darker, more twisted turn. The covert, fragile, or vulnerable narcissist, the kind that operates under a veil of self-consciousness, is plagued by cycles of shame. Clinical research, including work by Dr. Carol McBride, indicates that these individuals oscillate between grandiose fantasies and crushing self-loathing. They wake in the morning convinced of their entitlement. I deserve admiration, recognition, adulation. Perhaps they imagine themselves in the shoes of someone they envy, or project this fantasy onto a real person they know, a parent, a boss, a lover. But almost immediately, shame erupts. Psychologists call this shame over grandiosity, a signature hallmark distinguishing fragile narcissists from their openly grandiose counterparts. It is critical to recognize, however, that this is not the kind of shame most of us experience in ordinary life. It is not the human, adaptive shame that signals a misstep and invites repair, like snapping at a friend when stressed. It is an unhealthy, corrosive shame that arises from an internal dissonance. The narcissist simultaneously believes they are entitled to everything, yet knows deep down, often unconsciously, that this entitlement is unearned and unrealistic. Psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg describes this as a split between the idealized self and the actual self, generating profound internal tension. For the narcissist, this can manifest as anxiety, irritability, or secretive self-criticism, while the victim continues to be manipulated without relief. The psychological nuance here is subtle but devastating. In everyday life, adaptive shame motivates repair. You feel bad for being cold to a service worker, then apologize, restoring both your dignity and the other person's sense of being treated fairly. In contrast, the covert narcissist's shame is not reparative. It is self-focused, cyclical, and often secretive. They may momentarily feel the weight of their grandiose fantasies, but without external checks or genuine empathy, it does not lead to restitution. As Dr. Judith Herman notes in her work on trauma, this can make victims feel trapped in relationships where the abuser oscillates between entitlement, subtle manipulation, and pseudo-apologies that rarely address the real harm done. Yet, there are rays of insight for the victim. Understanding this cycle, the alternation between grandiosity and toxic shame, offers a roadmap for protection. Psychologists advise cultivating awareness of these patterns, strengthening boundaries, and seeking external validation from healthy sources rather than from the narcissist. Trauma-informed strategies include journaling experiences, engaging in supportive therapy, and differentiating between adaptive and toxic shame. Recognizing that the narcissist's shame is not about moral awareness but self-discomfort empowers victims to disengage without guilt, breaking the invisible tether of emotional exploitation. In essence, entering the fragile narcissist's mind is like standing inside a theater of grotesque mirrors. The reflection is alluring, intoxicating, yet fundamentally false. Psychologists stress that seeing the machinery behind the mask, the addiction to supply, the cycles of fantasy and shame, is the first step in reclaiming one's autonomy. For the victim, knowledge is the salve. The more they understand the psychology, the less likely they are to be entrapped, and the more they can transform observation into protection and recovery. Step with me again into this shadowy mental theater, our experiment in dark empathy. Picture the experience of shame, but not the kind that most of us know. Healthy shame, as psychologists from Brené Brown to Donald Nathanson emphasize, is protective. It's the moral guardrail that whispers, don't do that. Don't cross that boundary. Don't harm someone else simply because you're in pain. Healthy shame leads to reflection, repair, and growth. It's a signal of empathy, "I've hurt you, and I regret it." But the shame of the covert narcissist is of an entirely different species. Psychoanalysts call it neurotic shame, a shame not for harming others but for failing to extract enough admiration. It's not about conscience, it's about supply. According to Dr. Ramoni Dervisula, this shame arises when the narcissist's sense of entitlement collides with reality. They aren't ashamed of what they've done to people. They're ashamed they haven't succeeded in wringing enough veneration out of them. This distinction is crucial for victims. Understanding it reveals why apologies from such individuals often feel hollow, performative, or even manipulative. This neurotic shame breeds a kind of emotional volatility that psychologists recognize as emotional dysregulation. Covert narcissists are far more moody, reactive, and internally chaotic than their high-flying, grandiose counterparts. Clinical literature notes that vulnerable narcissism often co-occurs with anxiety disorders, depression, and substance abuse, attempts to medicate the storm within. Alcohol, drugs, or even compulsive behaviors may be used to dull the constant oscillation between grandiosity and humiliation. Victims often misinterpret this volatility as vulnerability, assuming the narcissist's breakdowns signal remorse. But as trauma specialist Dr. Judith Herman points out, dysregulation is not the same as contrition. It's a symptom of inner chaos, not moral reckoning. Now, imagine living inside such a mind. You're feeling shame not because you've bullied someone, but because you've failed to bully enough people. You're ashamed not for conning, but for failing to con the right kind of people, those who could grant you access, prestige, or admiration. Psychologists view this as an entitlement structure baked into the very architecture of the disorder. The covert narcissist doesn't merely want recognition, they believe they're owed it. When reality refuses to comply, shame and rage follow like thunder after lightning. For victims, recognizing this dynamic is vital. It clarifies that you are not responsible for their emotional turbulence, nor can you soothe it by giving more. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-5, notes these patterns of entitlement and arrogance, haughty or snooty demeanor, belief in special access to special people, conviction that the rules do not apply. Even where the DSM's framing is imperfect, it captures something essential. This personality style creates a constant, grinding sense of grievance. In the narcissist's inner movie, they are always destined for the top tier of whatever hierarchy they inhabit. School boards, workplaces, social circles, not for the responsibility of leadership but for the adoration that comes with status. The role they crave is not steward but sovereign. Psychologists call this status entitlement without accountability, and it sets up a vicious cycle. The narcissist reaches for a pedestal they cannot hold, falls short, plunges into neurotic shame, and lashes out or doubles down on manipulation to claw back supply. Victims caught in this cycle may feel like they're on an emotional seesaw, sometimes idealized, sometimes devalued, never at rest. Recovery begins with seeing the pattern. Boundaries, education, and support networks are the antidotes. Dr. Carol McBride suggests keeping written records of interactions to counter gaslighting, and surrounding oneself with affirming relationships that restore a grounded sense of self. This dark exercise in empathy is not to excuse the narcissist but to illuminate the trap. Understanding the inner workings of covert narcissism, the difference between healthy shame and neurotic shame, the built-in entitlement, the dysregulation and comorbidities, frees the victim from self-blame. As soon as you grasp that their shame is about supply, not harm, you step out of their psychic play and back into your own reality. Knowledge becomes not just power but protection. Imagine, for a moment, the inner monologue of a covert, fragile, vulnerable narcissist. It's not the slick villainy of movies but a flickering, anxious theater of self-doubt. The narcissist tells themselves, "I should be worshipped for my brilliance." Yet almost immediately another voice hisses back, "You're not going to trick them. They won't believe you. You're not strong enough. Not beautiful enough. Not powerful enough. Not rich enough." Psychologists such as Dr. Craig Malkin describe this as a hallmark of vulnerable narcissism, a grandiose self-concept constantly undermined by self-disparagement. It's not humility but a brutal internal tug-of-war. For the narcissist, this fuels emotional highs and lows. For the victim, it creates a disorienting environment of unpredictability. This emotional turbulence, what clinicians call lability or dysregulation, is confusing for those caught in its orbit. Targets of covert narcissistic abuse see someone sulky, petulant, sullen, and resentful, and wonder, why does this person swing so violently between superiority and despair? Psychologists explain that these moods emerge from narcissistic depletion, a state where the supply of admiration has run dry and the inner superego attacks with harsh, critical injunctions. Victims often mistake these collapses for vulnerability, imagining the narcissist feels remorse. In reality, as trauma therapist Dr. Judith Herman emphasizes, this isn't moral reckoning, it's withdrawal from an emotional drug. To combat this internal depletion, the covert narcissist reaches instinctively for domination. Bullying, subtle put-downs, or turning any interaction into a contest becomes their emotional anesthetic. Alfred Adler's theory of the inferiority complex is crucial here. The covert narcissist feels small and compensates by making others feel smaller. Even neutral conversations can become competitive arenas where they must win to soothe their insecurity. Victims experience this as a steady erosion of reality, where every disagreement, every casual comment becomes a battlefield. Recognizing this compensatory drive helps targets step back and refuse to play the game. This dynamic is particularly insidious in families. Children, as attachment researchers note, are biologically wired to venerate their parents. This makes them ideal audiences for covert narcissists. Parental narcissistic abuse often thrives in the home because children can be brainwashed into accepting the parent's narrative. Psychologists call this role conditioning, where kids learn to serve as mirrors for their parents' fragile self-esteem. Victims who grow up in such homes may later struggle with boundaries, self-doubt, and a skewed sense of what love feels like. Understanding this pattern, as Dr. Carol McBride writes, is the first step toward breaking intergenerational cycles of narcissistic abuse. But the strategy isn't confined to families. Covert narcissists bring the same tactics to workplaces and social circles. If they can cast themselves in a mothering role, male or female, boss or mentor, they replicate the bait-and-switch dynamic. Outwardly, they play the part of the caring leader or selfless nurturer. Inwardly, they're extracting admiration, compliance, and emotional labor from those under their influence. Psychologists describe this as pseudo-care, a form of manipulation that feels like support but is actually exploitation. Victims often sense the incongruity but doubt themselves, asking, "Am I crazy? They're so nice, sometimes." This is where the covert narcissist's split reality becomes most dangerous. In one reality, they're the loving parent, the protective boss, the benevolent friend. In the other, they're the entitled sovereign who believes they deserve worship without responsibility. Psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg calls this a split self-structure, a psychological division between fantasy and reality. For victims, this split creates cognitive dissonance. You're told you're loved and valued while simultaneously being undermined, manipulated, or devalued. This confusion can erode your sense of self until you no longer trust your perceptions. Psychologists advise several strategies for those trapped in this dual reality relationship. First, name the pattern. Understanding that the caring persona may be a facade helps neutralize its power. Second, strengthen your boundaries. Refuse to compete, refuse to justify, refuse to be baited. Third, seek external support from therapists or trusted friends who can validate your experiences and help you rebuild your sense of reality. As Dr. Judith Herman notes, recovery from narcissistic abuse begins with safety, proceeds through remembrance, and culminates in reconnect ion with a healthier self and community. So, in our experiment of dark empathy, we see the covert narcissist not as a mysterious enigma but as a predictable psychological system. Grandiosity entwined with self-loathing, pseudo-care masking domination, and competition as a substitute for connection. For the victim, seeing this machinery clearly is the first act of liberation. Knowledge breaks the spell. Boundaries keep you free. Look at what I've done for you. Look at what I've sacrificed for you. Sound familiar? These are the stories the covert, fragile narcissist tells, not just to themselves, but to anyone within their orbit. Psychologists describe this as a self-serving narrative, designed to induce guilt and shame in others. Dr. Ramoni Dervisula explains that this is a form of psychological coercion. The narcissist subtly conditions their targets into submitting to a reality where the narcissist is always benevolent, selfless, and deserving of admiration. For victims, this creates confusion and cognitive dissonance, making it difficult to separate kindness from manipulation. Over time, trauma specialists note, this can erode self-esteem and leave victims questioning their own perceptions and morality. On a larger scale, this pattern isn't limited to personal relationships. It can manifest in workplace hierarchies, social systems, and even governmental structures. But at its core, the covert narcissist operates in small, petty worlds. They rarely wield genuine authority or influence, so they cling to scraps of power wherever they can find them. Psychologists call this centralization of self. The narcissist positions themselves as the pivotal character in every narrative, every interaction, every experience. This creates a hyper-competitive environment where they measure every social encounter as a win or a loss. Alfred Adler's theory of the inferiority complex provides a lens for understanding this behavior. The narcissist inflates their sense of superiority to compensate for a deep, often unconscious sense of inadequacy. For victims, this means relationships are constantly tinged with subtle contests, manipulation, and coercion. Some fragile narcissists openly admit this worldview. Life, they believe, is a game of winners and losers. Psychologists warn that when such a perspective governs behavior, empathy and cooperation are sacrificed for perceived personal gain. Victims often find themselves walking on eggshells, unsure when a casual conversation will turn into a silent battle for dominance. Dr. Carol McBride emphasizes that the covert narcissist's greatest weapon is not overt aggression, but the quiet, corrosive undermining of others' confidence. By sowing doubt in their targets' minds, covert narcissists can inflict psychological harm more subtly and often more permanently than their grandiose counterparts. The key to navigating relationships with covert narcissists is meticulous observation over time. Psychologists stress the importance of tracking patterns of behavior rather than relying on intuition or instant judgments. Even individuals who pride themselves on emotional intelligence or psychological insight, like the INFJ personality type, cannot automatically detect covert manipulation. Awareness, persistence, and patience are essential. Victims must recognize that everyone plays social games to some extent. What distinguishes the pathological narcissist is the intensity and destructiveness of these games. For those seeking recovery, psychologists emphasize structured, stepwise approaches. Trauma-informed strategies focus on reclaiming agency, documenting interactions to counter gaslighting, establishing firm boundaries, and engaging in supportive networks that validate one's experience. Courses and therapeutic programs designed for victims of narcissistic abuse, like the structured approaches Dr. Ramoni Dervisula and Dr. Judith Herman advocate, are not quick fixes. True recovery involves understanding the mechanisms of abuse, dismantling internalized narratives, and rebuilding self-trust. With consistent effort, victims can eventually protect themselves from future narcissistic entanglements, restoring both clarity and emotional autonomy. Ultimately, observing the covert narcissist with clarity is an act of liberation. By identifying their petty games, their obsession with centrality, and their pattern of psychological coercion, victims reclaim the power that was stolen from them. Knowledge, as psychologists repeatedly stress, is the first step toward protection, healing, and ensuring that no one ever imposes such control over your mind and heart again. You through the eyes of the covert narcissist, diving into their psychological horror. Let's step together